One of the really cool and powerful capabilities that a server-side scripting language like PHP has that you don't see anywhere else in the web stack. It's not something HTML can do, it's not something CSS can do, it's not even something that JavaScript can do. This neat capability is the ability to be able to read from and write to files that are on the server's file system. What I wanted to do in this video is start by taking a look at how in PHP we have the ability to open files for editing, either reading or writing, and how we then close those files again. There's obviously a lot more to working with files in the server's file system than simply opening and closing them. We'll have to talk about reading and writing the files in a future video. But for right now, let's just see what it takes to be able to open a file and confirm that it's open and then close it again when we're done. In order to do these things, there's a handful of different PHP functions that we'll want to use. For starters, the function that we want to use to open a file is called fopen. The F, as you can imagine, probably stands for file, so this function is basically the file open function. And the way this particular function works is we need to provide it with two arguments, two pieces of information. The first piece of information we need to give it is we need to give it a file name. I could, for example, say create a file called data.txt. The second piece of information I need to provide to the function is what is called a mode. The mode that we open a file in is the way that we indicate to PHP in the fopen function why we're opening the file. We're opening the file for what purpose. There's a variety of different modes. If you go to the PHP documentation and look up the fopen function, you'll be able to find a list of all of them. But there are three of them in particular that I'll use primarily in these videos. One of them is the R mode. This would be the mode that we use whenever we simply want to read from a file. If we open a file in the R mode, we will be allowed to read from the file but not write to it. A second mode that's possible is the W mode. The W mode is the mode we would use to write to a file. If we open a file with the W mode, we'll be able to write to that file, but we will not read from it. One other behavior of the W mode is that whenever we open a file this way, if that file already exists, the file will essentially be erased, will be blanked out. So any new data that's written to a file that has been opened with the W mode, the new data that's written will overwrite any data that was in that file previously. Since that's not always the behavior we want, there's a third mode that very frequently comes in handy, which is the A mode. A here stands for append, and the append mode is very much like W in that it's used for writing to a file. The big difference, though, is that when you open a file in the append mode, any data that's in the file will remain in the file. Anything new that's then written to this file will be appended to the end. So let's give some of these a try. Let me start off with just the W mode. When I call the fopen function, pass it the name of a file and a mode to open it in, what the function is going to do is it is going to return to me a special value called a resource. A resource in PHP is a type of data, a data type essentially, and typically resources in PHP are used for representing things that are external to the script itself. So where a lot of data types, a lot of variables in PHP refer to things in our PHP scripts, when we get a resource, that usually refers to something outside. Like here, for example, the resource that's returned to us from the fopen function represents the file that we've asked to have open. We take that resource that's returned, we store it in a variable. So here I'm going to put it into a variable called $file. And from this point forward in the script, whenever I want to refer to that file, I'll just use that variable. It's nice that it works this way because it does mean that it's possible for us to open more than one file at a time. There's no reason I couldn't call fopen 3 separate times to open 3 separate files, potentially in 3 separate modes. When each one of those fopens is called, I can simply take that individual resource, store it in a different variable, say one called file1, the second called file2, and a third one called file3, where I could then use each of those individual variables with the resources they contain to be able to refer to any of those 3 open files during the execution of my script. All right, let me jump down here a couple lines. The next function I want to show you then is the function we use to close a file. The function we use to close a file when we're done is a function called fclose, file close essentially. And when we call it, we simply pass it the variable that contains the resource representing the file that we want to actually close. So here, fclose $file means close the file that was opened in my previous fopen statement. It is important to close files, especially if they are files that you have written to. When we open a file to write to it, and we give PHP instructions to put data to write into that file, that writing does not always take place immediately. Sometimes that output data is held in a buffer until there is more data, so a larger chunk of data can be written to the drive at the same time for efficiency's sake. The importance of the fclose function is that when we call it, it lets PHP know that the script is about to end or that we no longer have any intention of using that file, which basically tells PHP, flush the buffers, flush the output buffers. If there's any data that hasn't been written out to the file yet, write it now. If you ever get yourself into a situation where you open a file in PHP for writing, you seem to be writing data to it, you're seeing no errors, everything seems to be correct, but the data just simply isn't showing up in the file, double check and make sure you remembered to close the file, because what might be happening is that data is sitting there in the buffer, the script ends before the file is ever closed, so the buffer is simply wiped. The data never actually goes from the buffer into the file. So fundamentally, this is all I need to be able to do to open a file, to be able to close a file again. Before we actually give this script a run and see what it does, I wanted to show you, here's the directory where I actually have my script stored. This is the actual script that I'm typing in right now. It's called openandclose.php. I also, out in this same folder, have my style sheets that I use to make my scripts look a wee bit prettier when they're rendered in the browser. But what I wanted to point out is that currently there is no other file in this folder. So I've told PHP to create a file called data.txt. I wanted to essentially show you that right now there is no file here called data.txt. It's kind of a magician thing. I wanted to make sure you know I don't have a rabbit up my sleeve. Okay. So let me jump over to the browser now, and here's my script. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page with that new code that I've added to it. There we go. Essentially nothing happened, or nothing showed up in the browser anyway, best we can tell. If I jump back over and take a look at the folder that the script is running from, there it is, you can see that there's now a file there called data.txt. So through the process of me asking PHP to open that file in write mode, you can see that since the file did not already exist, PHP created it. So that is sort of concrete evidence that the script actually did open the file and then close it again. In this particular case, that actually caused the file to come into existence. Whenever we open a file in PHP, typically the next best thing that we want to do with it is to actually confirm that the file that we asked to have opened actually did open. We can do that simply by checking the resource that was returned from the fopen function. If the fopen function fails for any reason to be able to open the file, for example, if we're asking it to write or append to a file, but the drive is full or we don't have permission to write to that directory, or if we're opening a file for reading with the R mode, but the file just simply doesn't exist, what will happen in all of those situations is that the fopen function, instead of returning a valid resource, will instead return a value that is falsy, something we can actually check on with an if statement. So if I wanted to confirm, for example, that the file actually opened before I tried to close it, I could do something like say if we actually have a file, just as simple as that, then I could say something like echo file is open. If for whatever reason the file couldn't be opened, then I could echo the file could not be opened. I could take my fclose, which technically I only want to execute if the file actually did open. If the file didn't open, there's really nothing to close. So I could drop that in only if the value of file is true, which essentially means only if the file was actually opened. We could go give that another try and see how that works. If I jump back to my browser and refresh the page, there we go. Now I'm getting a little bit of output that says that the file is open. So like we saw before, if the file hadn't already been there, it would have been created. In this case, the file was already there, so it was simply opened for writing, and I was able to detect with an if statement whether the file was opened or not and display an appropriate message. Another detail about using the fopen function is that when we specify our file name, we have the ability, if we want to be able to take that file and store it in a different location. For example, Instead of having the file created right here in the same directory as the script itself, which is what will happen if I don't specify a path with the file name, I'm going to go ahead and delete that file. What I could potentially do instead is I could create a different directory in which to create that file. So I could maybe make another directory and I'll call it data. If I wanted to have my script create the new file that's being opened in that data directory, I could do that simply by providing it a path to that directory. So here when I call my fopen function, instead of simply providing the file name, I could say, starting from where the script currently is, go to the data directory, and then in that data directory create a file called data.txt. Again, if I go take a look at that in my browser, when I refresh the page, it tells me the file is open, so it does look like it was successful actually opening the file. And if I go back and take a look in that data directory, I can see that, yes, my file was actually created there. Right? Let's try something else here real quick. I'm going to open up that data.txt file. So here's the data.txt file as it looks right now. It's empty because at the moment I haven't used PHP to actually put any data into it. I'm just going to, by hand, through my text editor, type something into the file. This is the content of my data.txt file. And what I wanted to show you then is that if I go over and actually go to my browser, and in the browser, if I go to the URL for that particular file, now that file of course isn't HTML, it isn't PHP, but it is still in the same basic location, the same general location as my PHP files are, which means I can actually create a URL for it. So if I start in the same location where this current script is, and I go to /data/data.txt, you see that I can, if I want to, actually access that text file directly from the browser. Now that could actually be a bit of a security issue in the real world. In the real world, we might not necessarily want any person anywhere in the world to be able to maybe figure out what the name of our file names are, be able to type those into the browser, and then be able to see the content of these text files that PHP is working with directly. Maybe the purpose of these text files is that PHP is supposed to work with them, filter them, use them, things of that nature, but they're not really intended to be seen by just anybody. But here, given the fact that somebody can just type in a URL if they can figure it out, it's easy for us because we know what the file's called and where we stored it. But if somebody else were able to figure out that same thing, they could potentially see data that maybe we don't want them to see. So, something that's very often a good policy is that whenever you do use a text file from PHP, instead of storing it in the same directory as your PHP script or in a subdirectory below where your PHP script is stored, sometimes it's a good idea to actually put it up out of the directory structure where your PHP script is actually stored. So if the directory that my PHP script's in right now, which I called IO, if that directory were my web root, the place where the web server is willing to serve files from, I might actually want to go one step above that particular folder, one step above the web root folder, and create a folder out there, outside the scope of the files that the web server is willing to hand out. Since PHP is basically a running program on the server, it will still be able to access files that are outside the web root, but it will at that point not be possible for somebody else to be able to type in a URL to be able to access those files directly, which we might not want them to do. So with all of that in place, the next step we'll have to go through is to actually start reading from and writing to files. We won't do that here in this video as this one is going on a little bit long, but the basic process is simply going to be that any reading or writing we want to do from a file would go approximately right here. The general process when working with files in PHP is pretty much always going to involve opening the file, checking to make sure that the file actually is opened. If it is opened, then we go ahead and do whatever manipulations to that file we require, reading from it, writing to it. When we're finished with that, we can then close the file. We will very often then also have some kind of fallback that we will want to occur in the situation that the file can't actually be opened. But with that basic process in place, we'll be able to use files to do all kinds of wonderful things in our PHP scripts. Files become a very exciting thing, I think, at this point in the course because they offer us a form of persistence. Essentially, they offer us a way to be able to store data that can then be utilized later by other scripts. So instead of every script basically running on its own, more or less, in isolation, being able to write data to files and then retrieve that data again later gives us a way that we can begin to create persistent systems, groups of PHP pages that work off a common set of data. So some pretty neat things coming up.